behind the heavily guarded, iron-reinforced oak doors of a 16th-century English palace, the most powerful sovereign in the known world is slowly stripping away a deeply toxic mask of white lead and red clay, revealing the hidden scars of her absolute power. Tonight, we slip completely unnoticed into the silent candlelit shadows of a strictly forbidden royal bedchamber to witness the heartbreaking vulnerability and the incredibly dangerous, hidden rituals of a queen who traded her own physical well-being for an immortal golden crown. Welcome back to the channel today. Before we step out of the cold and into the royal chambers, please tell me your city and what time it is where you are in the comments below. Then get completely comfortable and let us gently drift together into the shadows of tonight's story. If you are a regular listener, do not forget to subscribe for more relaxing history. Hey friend, take a remarkably slow deep breath in, and as you exhale, go ahead and adjust your pillow and pull that soft, heavy blanket a little closer to your chin. Let the exhausting weight of the long day slide completely off your tired shoulders. Allow the heru holders and allow the heavy muscles in your back to sink deeply and peacefully into the mattress beneath you. It is the freezing, breathless midnight hour of December the 14th, 1592. We find ourselves standing entirely alone within the heavily fortified walls of Whitehall Palace, situated deep within the twisting heart of London. Just outside the towering stone architecture, a freezing, dense white fog rolling continuously off the dark, churning waters of the River Thames has entirely swallowed the sprawling city. The freezing mist clings to the uneven cobblestones and wraps itself tightly around the bare, shivering branches of the elm trees in the royal gardens, completely silencing the chaotic, ringing sounds of the bustling capital. The entire world outside has been plunged into a deep, frozen slumber. But here, inside the strictly guarded inner apartments of the Queen, the atmosphere shifts dramatically. The air is remarkably still, overwhelmingly warm, and thick with the comforting, rich scent of burning winter pine logs and the sharp, sweet fragrance of imported lavender water. You can hear the incredibly faint, rhythmic crackling of the glowing embers in the massive marble fireplace, providing the only heartbeat in an otherwise entirely silent room. The massive, dark crimson velvet curtains have been drawn tightly shut against the draughty, arched glass windows, completely isolating this magnificent, hidden sanctuary from the treacherous political world outside. As we quietly settle into the dim, flickering golden light of this private historic space, please remember that this is an ambient historical narrative curated exclusively for relaxation, sleep assistance, and educational entertainment. Derived from authentic primary records and antique chronicles, the prose has been softly adapted to foster a soothing, restful atmosphere. The immensely heavy, solid oak doors of the royal bedchamber swing shut with a slow, incredibly deliberate motion. The massive wrought iron latch drops into its deeply carved wooden groove with a dull, resonant thud that sends a faint vibration through the polished floorboards. With that singular, definitive closure, the chaotic, fiercely dangerous universe of the English court is abruptly and completely severed. Outside those imposing, impenetrable doors, the distant echoing melodies of high-strung lutes, the sharp clinking of silver goblets, and the rhythmic, thumping footsteps of ambitious noblemen fade instantly into an absolute, breathless void. The exhausting, relentless performance of the grand evening banquet is finally over. Inside the hidden chamber, the silence is so profoundly deep that it feels almost like a warm physical blanket settling gently over the vast room. The sovereign stands completely motionless near the center of the floor, surrounded by towering woven tapestries that line the freezing stone walls, their dyed woolen threads absorbing every stray echo. For the first time in 16 long, grueling hours, she does not have to smile, she does not have to nod her head in calculated agreement, and she does not have to fiercely analyze the hidden treason in every flattering whisper. she simply closes her eyes and breathes. Beneath the incredibly stiff, pearl-encrusted fabric of her highly structured bodice, the rapid, anxious fluttering of her chest begins to gradually slow down. Her heartbeat, previously a tight defensive drum, driving her through the treacherous political theatre of the day, now finds a much softer, significantly steadier rhythm. The crisp, clean scent of crushed, dried rosemary and sweet thyme scattered across the woven rush matting rises into the warm air as she slightly shifts her weight, fully grounding her deeply exhausted body in the quiet safety of the night. The incredibly slow, solitary transformation from an untouchable, gilded goddess back into a weary, fragile mortal woman has quietly begun in the comforting, dimly lit shadows. Before the silent ladies in waiting step out from the shadows to begin the delicate process of removal, let us take a fleeting moment to observe the quiet, comforting atmosphere of this room. If the hidden history of this royal chamber is bringing you peace tonight, please take a soft moment to gently press the like button and then allow the glowing light of your screen to fade completely away. Here inside the grand bedchamber, the environment is carefully curated to offer the Queen a profound sense of safety and isolation from the demanding world. The massive stone hearth blazes with logs of dry winter oak, projecting immense waves of soothing warmth across the room. Yet, for the sovereign, true physical rest remains just out of reach as long as she wears the heavy visage of the monarch. Her legendary complexion, achieved with a thick layer of traditional white cosmetic paint, has acted as a flawless porcelain shield against her political rivals throughout the long day. But now, in the absolute privacy of her chambers, this iconic makeup feels incredibly rigid and profoundly exhausting to carry. The perfectly placed beeswax candles burn with a breathtakingly clear, golden brilliance. Their soft, shifting amber light is deliberately chosen not just for its sweet honey fragrance, but for the gentle, forgiving way it illuminates the room. It casts long, soothing shadows that soften the sharp edges of the day, offering a quiet, unspoken grace to a ruler who has spent decades maintaining a legendary, unchanging facade to protect her throne. Every flicker of the flame seems to gently encourage her to let go, creating a peaceful sanctuary until she is entirely ready to wash the heavy burden of the monarchy away. From the deep, comforting velvet shadows at the far edges of the grand bedchamber, three of her most trusted ladies in waiting quietly approach the centre of the room. These devoted women do not merely serve the crown. They are the solemn, silent guardians of the Queen's deepest and most fiercely protected vulnerabilities. To the treacherous, sprawling royal court waiting endlessly outside these heavily guarded walls, Elizabeth is an ageless sovereign, a legendary figure seemingly carved from flawless white marble and entirely untouched by the natural weariness of age. But these carefully chosen few intimately know the deeply human reality of her daily sacrifices. They are the only living souls allowed to witness the immense physical and emotional toll of her absolute power. As they step softly across the thick, heavily patterned woven carpets, their dark woolen gowns make an incredibly soft, rhythmic swishing sound that blends seamlessly with the quiet crackling of the warm hearth. They carry delicate, hand-painted porcelain basins filled with warm, steaming rosewater, stacks of the absolute softest woven white linen cloths, and small, heavy glass jars containing pure, sweet almond oil. They move with an incredible, practiced grace without speaking a single word, for spoken words are entirely unnecessary in this deeply sacred, intimate space. They intuitively understand just how incredibly heavy the legendary illusion of the monarchy is to bear day after day. One lady steps forward to gently arrange the silver instruments and delicate glass vials upon the polished oak dressing table, her movements breathtakingly slow and deliberate, so that not a single clink of glass or metal disturbs the profound peace of the room. Another lady stands quietly just a few paces away, her eyes respectfully lowered, waiting for the exact unspoken moment when her sovereign is completely ready to begin. tonight. These women are not simply performing a mundane evening routine. They are faithfully helping their queen step down from the towering, lonely pedestal of history, carefully preparing to wash away the heavy myth and gently tend to the exhausted, deeply mortal woman hiding underneath the crown. The very first step in this quiet unmaking begins at the shoulders. The senior lady in waiting steps closely behind her queen to remove the heavy outer robe of state. This grand mantle is not merely a piece of clothing, it is a physical manifestation of the empire itself. Woven from endless yards of dense crimson velvet and thickly lined with heavy winter ermine, it carries the suffocating, silent weight of endless treaties, distant wars, and the relentless demands of the royal court. The maid raises her steady hands to the back of the queen's neck, locating the elaborate golden clasp that holds this massive burden in place. Her fingers move with practiced grace, gently maneuvering the heavy locking pin so it does not catch on the fragile lace of the collar. There is a singular, deeply satisfying click of cold metal sliding free. In that exact moment, a profound shift occurs. Two other maids step in immediately, catching the immense weight of the velvet before it can drag across the floorboards. As the heavy fabric is gracefully pulled away from her body, it makes a long, sweeping sigh against the silk undergown. The queen closes her eyes. The sudden, merciful absence of that tremendous pressure allows her rigid spine to finally soften. Her shoulders, held tight and highly defensive for 16 long hours, drop a fraction of an inch in the warm air. A long, silent exhalation escapes her lips. As the maids carry the heavy velvet away to be folded into the dark wooden chests, you can almost feel that exact same release mirroring in your own body, allowing your own shoulders to loosen and sink just a little deeper into the softness of your bed. The royal armour is finally beginning to fall. The shedding of the royal armour continues in the quiet, flickering light of the warm bedchamber, with the sweeping velvet robe now resting safely inside a heavy cedar chest. The silent ladies in waiting turn their careful attention to the magnificent, heavy jewels that physically bind their sovereign. Woven intricately into the elaborate fiery red styling of the queen's hair is a surprisingly heavy golden diadem, deeply encrusted with dark, blood-red rubies and raw, uncut diamonds. It is a smaller crown, designed specifically for the evening court, yet it still carries the undeniable, pressing weight of absolute authority. The senior maid steps closely to the side of her mistress, her gentle fingers moving with breathtaking precision to locate the long, sharpened golden pins that secure the heavy metal ring to the scalp. One by one, the long pins are gracefully and carefully withdrawn. There is a faint, comforting metallic whisper as the gold slides entirely free from the tightly coiled hair. The maid lifts the royal crown slowly, transferring it with the utmost reverence to a soft pillow of dark crimson velvet resting upon the polished oak dressing table. As the cold metal finally leaves her head, the queen tilts her chin slightly upward, rolling her stiff neck just a fraction to relieve the dull, continuous, and throbbing ache that has lived at the base of her skull since the very early hours of the morning. Next, the dedicated maids turn to address the endless cascading ropes of perfectly spherical, luminous pearls that drape heavily across her chest and stomach. These magnificent oceanic treasures, harvested from distant, turbulent seas, are a fierce, intentional symbol of her naval supremacy and the vast, undeniable wealth of her powerful island nation. To the admiring, watchful court, they are a dazzling display of a divine, untouchable right to rule. But to the deeply exhausted, mortal woman standing quietly in the centre of the warm bedchamber, they are merely a cage of coal, heavy restriction pressing relentlessly against her fragile collarbone and tight sternum. The closest lady in waiting reaches out, gathering the first heavy, luminous loop of pearls into her gentle, open hands. She lifts the long, heavy necklace carefully and deliberately over the queen's head. As the smooth, polished spheres gently brush against one another, they produce a deeply soothing, hollow clicking sound, a slow rhythmic clatter that echoes softly in the incredibly quiet room. The cool, heavy pearls slide gently past the queen's painted jawline and are slowly drawn away into the shadows. Instantly, a deeply noticeable physical weight is lifted from her chest, allowing her tired, restricted lungs to draw in a much deeper, far more satisfying breath of the warm, soothing, pine-scented air. Strand by long strand, the heavy, beautiful cages of wealth are patiently and silently dismantled. The attentive maids carry the long necklaces to an antique, highly polished walnut box lined entirely with the absolute softest midnight blue fabric. As the countless pearls are lowered into the heavy wooden chest, they pull together with a mesmerizing, fluid rustle, sounding exactly like a gentle, passing rain shower falling upon the surface of a quiet, hidden summer lake. The lid of the ornate jewelry box is gently lowered, closing with a soft, definitive thud that finalizes the separation of the queen from her magnificent treasury. Her throat is now entirely bare, and the overwhelming pressure upon her chest has significantly lessened, mirroring the quiet, steady slowing of your own heartbeat as you settle even deeper into the dark, comforting embrace of your own peaceful bed. As this deeply intimate history unfolds around us, wrapped safely in the warmth of the evening hearth, it is important to softly acknowledge that this content was generated with the assistance of specialized artificial intelligence models and subsequently analyzed, refined, and curated by the research team at Sleepy History with Karry, with all rights reserved. The magnificent treasury of pearls has been safely locked away in the dark, but the physical unbinding of the queen is far from over. The gentle, highly practiced hands of the ladies in waiting now move upward to address the deeply restrictive massive white wheel of fabric encircling the royal throat. This is the grand, iconic ruff, a towering symbol of her majestic reign, crafted from endless yards of the finest imported Flemish linen. To achieve its terrifyingly perfect, rigid structure, the delicate fabric has been heavily boiled with harsh wheat starch and painstakingly shaped with heated metal poking sticks until it resembles a series of immaculate, razor-sharp figure eights in the grand crowded halls of the palace. This architectural marvel serves a vital psychological purpose. It physically forces the queen to keep her chin elevated at a highly unnatural, imperious angle, ensuring that she is always looking down upon her ambitious subjects with the unyielding, intimidating gaze of a divine ruler. But here, in the profound, softly lit isolation of her private chambers, the grand collar is nothing more than an instrument of quiet torture. The heavy starch tightly traps the immense heat of the roasting fireplaces and the damp sweat of her own body directly against her highly sensitive skin, while the stiff, sharp edges of the linen relentlessly scratch at her painted jawline. The senior maid steps intimately close, her eyes completely focused on the delicate task at hand. She must carefully locate the long, sharpened brass pins that secure the massive collar tightly to the high neckline of the heavy bodice. As her delicate fingers find the hidden metal heads, she begins to draw them out one by one. The slow removal of each pin creates a dry, deeply satisfying scratching sound against the stiffened linen, a tiny acoustic release of tension in the deeply quiet room. As we watch this heavy, suffocating restriction slowly fall away, if you are finding comfort in this shared, peaceful release, please consider subscribing to the channel, allowing these quiet historical journeys to become a familiar, gentle companion for your own nightly rest. With the final brass pin gracefully removed, the maid gently parts the front of the massive linen wheel. She carefully pulls the rigid structure away from the queen's neck, creating a remarkably crisp, dry crinkling sound that echoes the soothing rustle of fallen autumn leaves blowing softly across a quiet courtyard. The sudden, merciful absence of the collar creates an immediate, profound physical transformation. For the very first time since the early hours of the morning, the sovereign is finally able to drop her chin. The incredibly tight, deeply strained muscles extending from the base of her skull down into her fragile collarbone are permitted to slowly stretch and elongate. A soft, cool draught of air from the vast room gently washes over her flushed, damp throat, instantly soothing the fiercely irritated skin where the heavily starched linen had ruthlessly pressed against her all day long. The Queen closes her heavily painted eyes and slowly rolls her head from side to side, silently savouring the exquisite, simple luxury of unimpeded movement. The towering, untouchable silhouette of the English monarch is steadily softening, melting away layer by heavy layer, revealing the deeply exhausted woman who merely wishes to breathe the cool night air in absolute peace. The delicate and deeply methodical dismantling of the royal silhouette now reaches the very core of her physical confinement. Beneath the removed outer layers of heavy velvet and shimmering silk lies the formidable stomacher, a highly structured, fiercely rigid garment designed to mould the Queen's torso into an impossibly flat, elongated shape of absolute perfection. Woven from the thickest imported canvas and densely reinforced with unbending strips of heavy whalebone, this hidden piece of armour acts as a relentless physical vise. Throughout the endless diplomatic meetings and the exhausting, highly calculated, courtly dances of the day, it violently restricts her lower lungs, forcing the sovereign to take only very shallow, tightly controlled breaths. It is the ultimate silent symbol of her remarkable reign, an unyielding cage that holds her entire physical being in a state of constant, highly defensive readiness against a world that endlessly watches for any sign of weakness. Now, standing quietly in the soothing warmth of the flickering firelight, the Queen gently rests her slender hands on the velvet-covered edge of the dressing table to steady her deeply exhausted frame. The most experienced lady in waiting steps forward, her skilled hands moving delicately to the intricate web of thick silk laces that firmly bind the heavy garment together. She carefully grasps the long dangling ends of the woven ribbon and begins to slowly, deliberately pull. As the tightly drawn silk is gradually pulled through the countless hand-stitched eyelets, it produces a remarkably soft, continuous brushing sound. It is a slow, rhythmic hush that repeats over and over again in the quiet room, sounding almost like the gentle, steady pulling of a heavy hemp rope upon a distant sailing ship quietly riding the midnight tide. With every single inch of the silken lace that is drawn entirely free, the agonizing, crushing pressure around the Queen's lower ribs incrementally begins to fade. In the profound silence of the bedchamber, we can hear the incredibly faint, muffled creaking of the tightly bound whalebone and the heavy starched canvas finally beginning to relax and bow outward, softly yielding to the natural gentle curve of her deeply weary body. The devoted maid completely loosens the very last lace, carefully parting the rigid structure and pulling it entirely away from the soft, remarkably thin fabric of the white linen undergown. The resulting physical release is beautifully, completely overwhelming. For the very first time since the pale, freezing grey dawn of the morning, the Queen's ribcage is entirely unrestricted. She parts her heavily painted lips and draws in a remarkably slow, incredibly deep breath of the warm, deeply fragrant air. The profound relief is instantly visible as her lungs are finally allowed to expand to their absolute fullest capacity, drinking in the sweet, soothing scent of dried English lavender and roasting winter pine logs. The deep, holding ache in her chest simply melts away into the surrounding amber shadows as she exhales that extraordinarily long, deeply held breath, releasing the immense political tension of the entire empire out into the quiet night. Allow your own breathing to gently mirror her profound relief. Let your chest slowly rise and fall in perfect quiet harmony, completely letting go of whatever heavy armour you have had to wear today, and simply allowing yourself to become entirely soft, deeply comfortable, and completely at peace in the dark. The final structural boundary of the royal facade remains firmly anchored around the waist of the Queen. This is the formidable farthingale, a massive undergarment constructed from concentric rings of flexible willow wood and tightly bound materials. To the countless observers crowding the royal court, this vast architectural skirt is simply a dazzling display of ultimate wealth and untouchable majesty. But for Elizabeth it serves a far deeper and much darker psychological purpose. It is a highly calculated architecture of physical isolation in a treacherous world dominated by fiercely ambitious men and deceitful foreign ambassadors. The Queen uses this enormous garment as a literal fortress wall, by forcing everyone to stand several feet away from her, simply to hold a conversation. She ensures that no one can ever get close enough to see the profound exhaustion hiding deep within her eyes, or notice the faint, nervous trembling of her hands after a grueling council meeting. It artificially expands her physical presence, transforming a mortal woman into an immovable, towering monument of English dominance that cannot be easily approached or intimidated. Yet, underneath the heavy gold brocade and the endlessly thick layers of imported silk, the Queen carries this grand fortress entirely alone. The rigid wooden hoops press heavily against her hips all day, demanding a constant, exhausting physical balance. Every single step she takes down the long palace corridors requires immense hidden effort, pulling the heavy, swaying carriage of the massive skirt along the cold stone floors, while maintaining an illusion of effortless divine grace. Now, in the absolute safety and quiet warmth of her private chambers, this vast political shield is no longer required. The senior lady in waiting kneels gracefully beside her sovereign, reaching deep into the heavy, shadowy folds of the overskirt to locate the thick braided cords that secure the heavy wooden cage to her body. As the maid carefully and deliberately unties the complex knots, the Queen prepares to surrender the very last layer of her formidable daytime armour. The heavy structure finally yields to gravity. The massive skirt slowly collapses inward, falling away from the Queen and settling heavily onto the floorboards. It does not drop suddenly, but rather sinks with a slow, exhausted surrender, much like a heavy velvet curtain closing at the very end of a long, tragic play. The magnificent dress pools entirely around her feet, forming a wide, shimmering circle of discarded majesty in the dim candlelight. The Queen gently lifts the hem of her simple white linen undergown and steps quietly out of the centre of the collapsed cage. The emotional and physical transformation in the room is deeply profound. Stripped of the massive, artificially constructed width of the farthingale, her silhouette is instantly altered. She is no longer the giant, imposing deity of the English realm. She is merely a slender, deeply weary woman who has carried the unimaginable weight of an entire nation for far too long. The immense, aching strain in her lower back and hips begins to slowly dissolve, replaced by a profound, comforting lightness that spreads through her tired limbs. As she steps away from the fallen monument of her own clothing, she leaves the untouchable Queen behind on the floor. She allows herself the rare, deeply quiet grace of simply being human, entirely vulnerable, stripped of all her heavy defences, and profoundly ready to find peace in the dark. The heavy silks and stiffened canvas are carefully gathered from the floorboards by the devoted ladies in waiting. They carry the immense weight of the discarded wardrobe toward the shadowy corners of the chamber, where massive, deeply carved cedar trunks quietly await. As the maids gently lay the intricate gold embroidery and thick crimson velvet into the dark depths of the wooden chests, they are essentially putting the grand, formidable myth of the English monarch to bed for the night. The rich, calming scent of dried lavender and crushed cedar wood rises into the warm air, acting as a natural, soothing preservative meant to keep the royal garments safe from the dampness of the castle. Just as the exhausting heavy armour of the day is carefully folded and locked away in the quiet dark, give yourself the gentle permission to fold away the heavy, lingering thoughts of your own day. If these quiet journeys into the past bring comfort to your nights, please consider subscribing to the channel, allowing our stories to become a peaceful, familiar sanctuary for your mind to rest. With the physical confinement of the deeply restrictive dresses completely gone, the true, fiercely guarded focus of the night finally begins. The Queen slowly walks toward the beautifully polished oak dressing table and gracefully lowers her exhausted body into a heavily padded velvet chair. She looks deeply into the ornate silver mirror resting patiently before her. Staring back in the dim golden candlelight is the legendary mask of youth. It is a thick, highly opaque layer of traditional cosmetic paint, composed of harsh white lead and fermented vinegar, designed specifically to hide any trace of mortal vulnerability from her calculating court. After a grueling day of navigating the treacherous, shifting ambitions of foreign dignitaries and domestic rivals, the heavy white crust feels incredibly tight and suffocating. It is faintly cracking around the weary corners of her eyes and the edges of her mouth, a silent testament to the thousands of forced smiles and carefully measured words she had to deliver since the dawn. To gently dismantle this toxic facade requires the utmost care and profound devotion. The ladies in waiting approach the dressing table, not merely as servants of the crown, but as quiet, deeply trusted healers. They bring forward elements of absolute natural purity to carefully combat the harsh, destructive chemistry of the royal makeup. A heavy silver pitcher is gracefully tilted, pouring steaming, fragrant rosewater into a shallow, hand-painted porcelain bowl. The sweet, floral vapor gently rises into the cool air, drifting across the Queen's face and beginning to slowly soften the hardened edges of the heavy lead paint. Beside the steaming bowl, a small glass vial of rich, sweet almond oil and a delicate cup of fresh, cool milk are set down upon the velvet cloth. These incredibly simple, deeply comforting natural remedies are the ancient, quiet magic required to draw the heavy toxins from her weary skin. The Queen closes her heavily painted eyes, feeling the warm, soothing steam lightly brushing against her cheeks. She is profoundly ready to surrender the flawless, untouchable face of the empire, desperate to finally find the soft, deeply vulnerable, and entirely human truth hiding patiently beneath the heavy white mask. Before the heavy white lead can be carefully washed from the sovereign's deeply exhausted face, there is one final, towering piece of the grand political illusion that must be dismantled. Resting heavily upon her aching head is the iconic, fiercely vibrant red wig. This elaborate construction of tightly curled silk threads and perfectly dyed human hair is far more than a simple fashion piece. It is the fiery, undeniable symbol of the powerful Tudor dynasty. To the admiring and deeply fearful court, that striking crimson colour is a constant, aggressive reminder of her formidable father, the terrifying King Henry VIII. By wearing his fiery colours, she projects an aura of immense inherited strength and unyielding authority. But in the quiet, shadowy reality of her private bedchamber, the magnificent red hairpiece is merely another suffocating layer of armour. It traps the intense heat of the blazing fireplaces against her sensitive scalp, causing a relentless, dull pressure that slowly builds behind her eyes throughout the long, demanding hours of the royal day. The senior lady in waiting steps gently behind the velvet chair, her hands moving with breathtaking lightness and absolute precision. She begins to carefully navigate the complex network of hidden brass pins and tight silken threads that anchor the heavy wig to the Queen's natural hair. The removal must be incredibly slow, ensuring that no sudden movement pulls painfully at the deeply irritated scalp. In the profound silence of the softly lit room, you can hear the incredibly faint, dry scraping of the long metal pins being drawn smoothly out of the dense curls. One by one, the heavy anchors are removed and laid softly upon a small velvet cushion. As the very last pin is gracefully withdrawn, the devoted maid gently places her hands on either side of the towering red structure and slowly, deliberately lifts it straight up into the warm air. The physical release is immediate and entirely overwhelming. As the heavy, suffocating weight leaves her head, the queen lets out a long, trembling sigh of pure, profound relief. The cool, quiet air of the vast chamber rushes gently over her damp scalp, instantly soothing the deep, lingering heat that had been trapped there since the early hours of the morning. You can almost feel that exact same gentle release spreading across your own forehead, allowing the tight muscles around your eyes and temples to finally soften and melt away into the dark. Freed from the oppressive weight of the false hair, the deeply hidden truth of the aging monarch is quietly revealed to the flickering candlelight. Her natural hair, once famously thick and golden red in her fading youth, is now incredibly thin, fragile, and heavily silvered. It has been deeply damaged not only by the relentless passage of time and the profound stress of ruling a fractured nation, but also by the slow, unavoidable poison of the lead-based makeup she wears every single day. Yet the loyal women surrounding her do not look upon her with pity. They view her fragile greying hair with an immense unspoken reverence, recognizing it as the deeply honorable battle scars of a woman who has sacrificed her own physical vitality to keep her beloved country safe and prosperous. With the false hair completely removed, the ladies in waiting turn their entire focus to the beautifully painted porcelain bowl resting upon the dressing table. The sweet floral steam rising from the warm rosewater fills the immediate space with a deeply calming, soporific fragrance. A maid takes an incredibly soft, perfectly white square of imported linen and gently submerges it into the warm water. The delicate fabric eagerly drinks in the soothing liquid, turning heavy and completely saturated. She lifts the dripping linen from the bowl, gently squeezing the excess water away until the cloth is perfectly damp and wonderfully warm. The quiet, rhythmic sound of the water softly splashing back into the porcelain basin is entirely hypnotic, a slow, steady liquid lullaby that signals the true beginning of the Queen's healing. Holding the warm, fragrant cloth with utmost care, the maid steps softly back to the side of the weary sovereign. The deeply toxic, impenetrable mask of Gloriana is finally about to be washed away, allowing the exhausted, deeply mortal woman beneath to breathe the night air and find her well-deserved rest. The devoted lady in waiting stands completely still for just a fraction of a moment, holding the warm, damp square of pure white linen gently between her fingertips. The sovereign closes her heavily painted eyes and slightly tilts her chin upward, silently offering her weary face to the healing shadows of the quiet bedchamber. The very first point of contact is the absolute center of the Queen's deeply exhausted forehead. For 16 relentless hours, this incredibly fragile expanse of skin has been entirely sealed beneath a thick, highly abrasive crust of traditional royal cosmetic paint. The deeply toxic mixture of heavy white lead and highly acidic fermented vinegar had dried into a stiff, impenetrable mask, essentially suffocating the delicate pores and drawing absolutely all natural moisture from the surface of her face. It was a flawless, terrifying shield, designed specifically to reflect the bright daylight and blind her ambitious enemies. But underneath its pristine surface, the Queen's skin was quietly crying out for the simple mercy of the cool night air. As the gentle warmth of the damp linen finally presses against her brow, the physical sensation is one of absolute exquisite relief. You can almost feel the exact moment the warm, fragrant rosewater begins to seep into the microscopic cracks of the hardened white paint. The soothing moisture moves incredibly slowly, deliberately breaking down the harsh chemical bonds of the toxic lead and the sharp, biting vinegar. The stiff, chalky barrier, which had held her facial expressions in a tight, unyielding grip all day long, begins to deeply soften. It melts away from her irritated skin with a quiet, invisible sigh, yielding completely to the ancient, natural purity of the warm water and the careful, devoted hands of the royal maid. The lady in waiting applies a remarkably gentle, perfectly even pressure Slowly drawing the warm cloth across the forehead, she traces the natural sweeping curve of the brow bone and moves smoothly outward toward the incredibly delicate, pulsing skin of the temples. As the very first heavy stroke of the toxic paint is carefully wiped away, exposing the bare, flushed skin underneath, the queen lets out a long, trembling breath that she has seemingly held tightly within her chest since the pale light of morning. The heavy muscles of her forehead, which had been locked in a fierce, commanding expression of absolute authority to intimidate the foreign ambassadors, are instantly given the quiet permission to completely surrender. The deep, lingering tension resting heavily between her eyes simply dissolves, melting seamlessly into the warm floral steam of the floating rosewater. Just as the exhausted queen allows the tight, anxious muscles of her face to completely relax in the quiet, golden shadows of her private sanctuary, I invite you to gently do the exact same in the safety of your own room. Let your own brow become entirely smooth. Willfully release any hidden, stubborn tension you might be holding tightly in your jaw. Let your tongue rest quietly away from the roof of your mouth, and allow your heavy eyelids to sink just a little bit deeper into the soothing, welcoming darkness. The heavy protective masks we all wear to face the demanding world are no longer needed here, as the royal maid turns the warm linen cloth over. To find a clean, untouched surface, the heavy silence of the room seems to breathe a collective sigh of comfort, fully prepared to gently wash the rest of the exhausting day away. The royal maid carefully folds the damp, fragrant linen cloth, turning it in her gentle hands to find a clean, wonderfully warm surface. Moving slowly down from the perfectly smooth expanse of the exposed forehead, she brings the soothing fabric to rest softly against the queen's deeply flushed cheeks. This specific area is the very heart of the grand royal illusion, the thickest and most heavily guarded layer of the Venetian ceruse. As the warm rosewater begins to slowly dissolve the rigid, chalky white boundary, the profound historical truth of her incredible reign is quietly drawn into the golden candlelight. Beneath the flawless, untouched porcelain facade she presents to the treacherous world, the skin of her cheeks is faintly uneven, bearing the permanent, indelible marks of a terrifying battle fought and won many long decades ago. In the dark, freezing winter of 1562, a devastating wave of the smallpox plague swept furiously through the grand halls of Hampton Court Palace, nearly claiming the life of the young sovereign. For countless agonizing days, the entire kingdom held its collective breath in absolute terror, while deeply ambitious noblemen quietly sharpened their political knives in the shadows, eagerly waiting for the vulnerable crown to fall. Against all impossible odds, she survived the brutal fever, but the violent illness left its unforgiving signature across her face. The heavy white paint she wears every single day is not born out of a shallow, hollow vanity. It is a vital, desperate instrument of survival. It deliberately hides the physical proof that the mighty queen is entirely mortal, ensuring that no ambitious rival or foreign king can ever look upon her face and see the lingering ghost of human weakness. But tonight, surrounded completely by the fierce loyalty of her closest companions and the deeply comforting warmth of the massive stone heart, that heavy protective armour is finally allowed to wash away. The maid sweeps the warm cloth across the cheekbones in incredibly slow, highly rhythmic circles, gently lifting away the harsh, acidic mixture of white lead and fermented vinegar. The faint, sharp scent of the toxic makeup is instantly replaced by the rich, soothing aroma of sweet almond oil that another maid carefully prepares in a small glass vial. The scarred surface of her cheek, hidden away in the dark, suffocating confinement of the paint for the entirety of the long day, eagerly drinks in the simple, healing moisture of the wet cloth. The queen slowly turns her head, allowing the soft linen to deeply caress the opposite cheek, willingly surrendering the last major piece of her grand defensive shield. She does not look away from her own reflection in the polished silver mirror. She embraces the faint, textured reality of her own skin, quietly acknowledging the immense, unspoken strength it took to survive that terrible illness, and the even greater strength it takes to rule a deeply divided nation entirely alone, as the heavy toxic facade completely disappears into the wet folds of the white linen. The crushing emotional weight of having to constantly prove her own divine immortality simply melts away into the shadows. Her breathing becomes remarkably deep and wonderfully steady, echoing the deeply peaceful rhythmic rise and fall of a quiet ocean tide. It is a slow rhythmic breathing that quietly invites you to let go of your own hidden defenses, to release the heavy armor you wear for the outside world, and to simply rest quietly in the safe, entirely forgiving embrace of the night. The delicate, deeply meticulous process of revealing the true sovereign now moves upward to the most fragile and fiercely guarded feature of her face. It is time to gently tend to the eyes. Throughout the long, treacherous day, the eyes of the Queen are her most formidable, unwavering weapons. Lined heavily with a dark, deeply pigmented mixture of crushed soot and heavy antimony, her gaze is purposefully designed to be incredibly piercing, unyielding, and utterly terrifying to those who dare to challenge her authority. She must use those dark, heavily painted eyes to pierce through the flattering lies of foreign ambassadors, to carefully read the heavily coded letters of her countless spies, and to constantly scan the dark corners of the royal court for any sudden sign of hidden treason. But maintaining that relentless, sweeping vigilance requires an immense, unspoken toll. The harsh, dark minerals clinging tightly to her eyelashes cause a dry, continuous burning ache that settles deep behind her eyes long before the winter sun ever sets. The senior lady in waiting sets aside the damp rosewater cloth and reaches for the small, heavy glass vial, resting patiently upon the oak dressing table. She tips the vial with agonizing care, allowing a few thick, golden drops of pure, sweet almond oil to fall onto a completely fresh square of incredibly soft, imported white linen. The rich, golden oil is completely natural, profoundly soothing, and entirely devoid of the harsh, acidic bite of the traditional royal cosmetics. The Queen tilts her head slightly back against the high velvet cushion of her chair, and willingly allows her heavy eyelids to flutter entirely shut. She gracefully surrenders her powerful vision to the quiet, flickering shadows of the room, choosing to finally stop watching the endlessly demanding world around her. The royal maid steps intimately close, resting the oil-soaked linen gently against the Queen's closed right eyelid. The physical sensation is one of immediate, exquisite comfort. The thick, warm almond oil effortlessly melts through the stubborn, hardened crust of the black makeup, smoothly dissolving the heavy pigments without requiring any harsh or painful rubbing. The maid holds the cloth perfectly still for a long, quiet moment, allowing the deep, natural warmth of the oil to seep directly into the incredibly thin, fragile skin resting over the eye. The deeply rooted, throbbing ache hidden just behind the sovereign's brow begins to miraculously soften and pull away. As the dark, toxic makeup dissolves into the warm cloth, the Queen feels the heavy, anxious muscles completely surrounding her eyes finally let go, allowing her deeply exhausted eyes to simply rest quietly in their sockets. The maid repeats the highly soothing, rhythmic motion on the opposite eye, carefully wiping away the very last traces of the dark, imposing gaze of the legendary monarch. With her eyelids completely cleansed and generously coated in the deeply nourishing, fragrant oil, the Queen keeps her eyes comfortably shut. The profound darkness hiding behind her closed eyelids is no longer filled with the terrifying, swirling anxieties of the Empire, the approaching Spanish fleets, or the endless parliamentary debates. It is now simply a deep, incredibly soft, and entirely peaceful void. As the Queen fully embraces the quiet, heavy darkness of true rest, I invite you to gently mimic her profound, willing surrender. Allow your own eyelids to become incredibly heavy, Let the tiny, complex muscles surrounding your eyes completely relax and unbind. You no longer need to watch the world tonight. Simply let the darkness wash completely over you, deeply warm, entirely safe, and profoundly peaceful. The delicate unmaking of the sovereign now descends toward the incredibly expressive, fiercely guarded mouth. Throughout the endless, demanding hours of the royal day, the lips of the queen are the ultimate, terrifying instrument of her absolute power. From this mouth pour the definitive, unyielding decrees that shape the immense destiny of the entire English Empire. It is the very source of the fiery, legendary speeches that inspire her heavy armour-clad armies to stand against the massive Spanish fleets, and it is the quiet, devastating origin of the whispered commands that seal the dark fate of ambitious traitors hidden within the Tower of London. To amplify this immense, undeniable authority, her lips are thickly painted every single morning with a highly saturated, vibrant red paste. This striking royal cosmetic is painstakingly crafted from natural beeswax deeply mixed with heavy red ochre and incredibly toxic crushed cinnabar. The heavy mixture creates a brilliant, imposing slash of crimson against the stark white lead of her face, but it leaves her mouth feeling remarkably stiff, coated in a dry, faintly metallic taste that completely parches her throat as the grueling hours drag endlessly on. The senior lady-in-waiting selects a completely fresh, remarkably soft square of imported white linen, lightly dampening it with the remaining warm, sweet-smelling rosewater. She approaches the queen with the utmost reverence, pausing for a deeply respectful moment before gently pressing the warm cloth against the tightly closed lips of the sovereign. The natural warmth of the water and the gentle, incredibly careful pressure of the maid's fingertips immediately begin to melt the stubborn, waxy bonds of the heavy crimson paint. As the cloth is drawn slowly and deliberately across the mouth, the bright, artificial red is gracefully wiped away, transferring entirely to the damp linen and leaving behind the deeply pale, entirely natural and profoundly weary lips of the mortal woman beneath. The physical relief is beautifully immediate. The queen gently parts her newly cleansed lips, letting out a remarkably soft, almost entirely silent sigh as the dry, restrictive crust is completely removed. The faintly bitter, earthy taste of the heavy minerals is instantly replaced by the clean, sweet and comforting fragrance of the floating rose water. But the deepest, most profound relief is entirely psychological. With the heavy red paint completely gone, the towering, terrifying voice of the immortal monarch is officially silenced for the night. There are absolutely no more royal decrees to be given, no more sharp, witty debates to be waged against the manipulative foreign ambassadors, and no more heavy, impossible decisions to be made regarding the survival of her deeply fractured realm. The queen allows her jaw to entirely relax, letting her teeth part just a fraction in the soothing darkness. The exhausting burden of having to constantly speak with absolute divine authority has finally been lifted from her shoulders. She embraces the profound heavy silence of the dim bedchamber, a deeply comforting quiet that asks absolutely nothing of her. As the royal maid gently steps away, taking the stained linen cloth into the shadows, the queen simply breathes in the warm, pine-scented air. I invite you to join her in this beautiful, absolute silence. Allow your own jaw to gently unbind, let your lips soften, and completely release any lingering words or anxious thoughts you might still be holding in your mind. There is absolutely nothing left to say tonight, nothing left to figure out, and nothing left to decide. There is only the quiet, steady rhythm of your own breathing, guiding you slowly and safely into a deeply peaceful, unbroken sleep. The delicate, deeply methodical process of dismantling the royal mask now reaches its final, profoundly pure conclusion. The senior lady in waiting turns her head slightly, offering a silent, practiced signal to a younger maid standing quietly in the deep velvet shadows near the heavy oak door. The young woman steps gracefully forward, carrying a beautifully polished, completely unadorned silver basin in her hands. Unlike the previous delicate vessels filled with steaming, heavily perfumed rosewater or thick, golden almond oil, this heavy silver basin contains only crisp, remarkably cold spring water, drawn fresh from the deep ancient underground wells lying far beneath the sprawling stone foundations of the palace. There are absolutely no crushed flower petals, no sweet dried herbs, and no heavy essential oils mixed into this particular basin. It holds only the absolute undeniable purity of untouched water, entirely free from the complex, exhausting alchemy of the royal court. The senior maid takes a completely fresh, exceptionally large square of pure white imported linen and slowly submerges it into the cold water. The quiet, rhythmic splashing sound of the cool liquid being gently pushed around the edges of the silver basin rings out clearly in the deeply hushed bedchamber. It is a highly soothing liquid melody, sounding exactly like a small hidden woodland stream softly flowing over smooth river stones in the dead of the night. She carefully wrings the heavy saturated fabric, allowing the excess water to fall gently back into the basin in a slow, mesmerizing and continuous trickle. Stepping intimately close to the deeply exhausted sovereign, the devoted maid gently drapes the remarkably cool, damp linen across the entirety of the queen's bare face. The sudden, incredibly beautiful contrast of the crisp, cold water pressing softly against her deeply inflamed, overworked skin provides a sudden wave of absolute physical ecstasy. The cooling moisture instantly draws out the very last lingering heat of the blazing fireplaces and completely washes away the final, microscopic chemical traces of the highly toxic white lead. The faint, sharp and deeply unpleasant scent of the fermented vinegar, which had clung stubbornly to her skin throughout the endless day, is finally and entirely neutralized by the breathtaking freshness of the pure spring water. For the very first time in 16 grueling hours, every single pore on the Queen's weary face is completely free to expand and deeply breathe in the dark, pine-scented air of the warm bedchamber. The heavy, suffocating wall built intentionally between her fragile humanity and the demanding world has been completely washed away into the dark. She is no longer Gloriana, the untouchable, terrifying and ageless deity of the English realm. She is entirely mortal, remarkably soft, and profoundly vulnerable in the flickering golden candlelight. As the cool, healing moisture settles deeply into her tired skin, I invite you to imagine a gentle, incredibly cool evening breeze washing softly over your own face in the dark. Let that imaginary, soothing wind carry away the very last scattered fragments of your busy thoughts, leaving your mind completely clear, beautifully empty, and profoundly ready to slip seamlessly into a deep, unbroken, and incredibly peaceful sleep. The crisp, incredibly cold spring water has successfully washed away the heavy, toxic poison of the royal facade, but the bare skin left behind remains deeply fragile and profoundly tired. The harsh, biting acidity of the fermented vinegar and the highly abrasive nature of the crushed white lead have left a faint, lingering irritation across the Queen's cheeks and forehead. To leave her skin in such a vulnerable, exposed state would be a deeply cruel ending to a grueling day. The senior lady, in waiting gracefully, sets the heavy silver basin aside and reaches for a small, perfectly smooth alabaster jar, resting quietly in the warm shadows of the oak dressing table. Inside this delicately carved ancient white vessel lies a deeply restorative, entirely natural healing balm. It is a thick, incredibly rich ointment, painstakingly crafted by the most skilled royal apothecaries in the kingdom. To create this soothing remedy, they melt down pure, unbleached beeswax, gathered directly from the royal gardens, carefully blending it with highly refined, deeply nourishing natural tallow and incredibly concentrated, earthy extracts of sweet calendula and deeply healing comfrey root. The royal maid gently dips her index and middle fingers into the small alabaster jar, The thick, solid balm immediately begins to soften and melt upon contact with the natural heat of her skin. She slowly rubs her fingertips together, patiently warming the rich ointment until it transforms from a heavy paste into a perfectly smooth, beautifully viscous golden liquid. The incredibly warm, deeply grounding scent of crushed earth, sweet wax and dried summer herbs quietly replaces the sharp, lingering memory of the daytime cosmetics, stepping intimately close to the deeply exhausted sovereign. Once again, the devoted maid begins to carefully apply the warm, healing balm to the highly sensitive, beautifully bare face of the queen. The application is breathtakingly slow. It is a carefully orchestrated series of deeply rhythmic, sweeping circles, beginning at the very centre of the flushed cheeks and moving gradually outward toward the hairline and down along the soft, relaxed jawline. The warm healing ointment glides absolutely effortlessly over the heavily taxed skin. As the rich natural moisture seeps deeply into her weary pores, the faint, stinging irritation left behind by the harsh chemical makeup is instantly and completely neutralized. It is immediately replaced by a deeply protective, profoundly comforting layer of natural warmth. For the queen, sitting entirely motionless in the dim golden candlelight, this is a rare, exquisitely beautiful moment of profound grace. In a sprawling royal court filled entirely with endless deceit, calculated manipulation, and fierce political ambition, the incredibly gentle, devoted touch of her trusted ladies-in-waiting represents the only true unconditional care she ever receives. The slow, rhythmic and sweeping massage expertly draws out the very last, deeply hidden remnants of facial tension. The queen's jaw goes completely slack in the warm air, and her breathing deepens into a remarkably slow, deeply hypnotic rhythm. The heavy, aching burden of ruling a fiercely divided nation simply dissolves under the gentle, healing pressure of the maid's fingertips. As the comforting, earthy fragrance of the warm herbal balm fills the quiet bedchamber, allow that exact same feeling of profound, unconditional healing to gently wash over you. Imagine a warm, deeply soothing weight settling softly across your own forehead, tracing the quiet line of your jaw, and entirely erasing the heavy, exhausting wear and tear of your own long day. You are completely safe here in the quiet dark, beautifully cared for, and deeply ready to let go of the waking world. With the deeply sensitive skin of her face completely restored and safely protected by the warm, earthy herbal balm, the quiet, methodical unmaking of the sovereign naturally progresses to the immense physical strain carried deeply within her body. Throughout the endless, highly demanding daylight hours, the queen's fragile neck and surprisingly narrow shoulders serve as the primary physical foundation for the entire English empire. They must bear the crushing literal weight of heavy velvet mantles, sweeping fur-lined capes and towering, intricately starched linen collars. But far beyond the physical garments, these deeply exhausted muscles carry the invisible, profoundly agonizing burden of absolute authority. She must constantly hold her spine entirely rigid, pulling her shoulders back to project an unwavering, immovable pillar of divine strength to a sprawling royal court that endlessly watches the shadows for any minute sign of structural weakness or mortal decay. She is the solitary anchor of a fiercely divided nation, and she is simply never allowed to bend. But here, wrapped safely in the profound flickering shadows of her intensely private bedchamber, that defensive, rigid posture is finally allowed to quietly collapse. The senior lady-in-waiting steps completely silently behind the heavily padded velvet chair. She carefully warms a few final, golden drops of sweet almond oil between her own palms, patiently waiting for the liquid to match the comforting heat of the surrounding air, before resting her gentle, experienced hands firmly at the very base of the queen's skull. The physical contact is deeply grounding. The thick, heavily knotted tendons extending down the back of the royal neck, which have been wound as tightly as the heavy hemp ropes of a massive warship all day long, finally encounter a quiet force that does not demand absolutely anything from them. The devoted maid presses her thumbs in remarkably slow, deeply penetrating circles, deliberately tracing the tight, weary muscles down the graceful length of the neck and outward across the sharp, deeply aching ridge of the collarbone. As the warm oil expertly reduces the friction, the intense, holding heat trapped within the muscle tissue begins to slowly dissipate. The queen lets her chin fall forward, just a fraction of an inch, a profoundly beautiful gesture of complete trust and utter surrender that she would never dare to display in the treacherous, calculating light of the day. For this brief, beautifully suspended moment in time, she does not have to hold the entire world up all by herself. She can quietly lean into the supportive, unconditionally loyal hands of another human being. As the heavy, accumulated stress of the long political day is expertly and patiently kneaded away from the Queen's exhausted shoulders, I gently invite you to bring your own quiet awareness to that exact same place within your own body. Notice if you are unknowingly holding your shoulders tightly up near your ears, maintaining a silent, highly defensive guard against the lingering demands and anxieties of your own waking world. Consciously give yourself the quiet, absolute permission to let them drop. Allow your shoulders to sink heavily and deeply into the soft mattress beneath you. Feel the vast, comforting surface of your bed entirely rise up to support your weight, completely absorbing whatever heavy burdens you have carried today. There is nothing left to hold up, nothing left to carry, and absolutely nothing left to defend against. You are entirely safe to let go. The deeply soothing unmaking of the monarch now moves downward from her carefully softened shoulders, tracing along her surprisingly slender arms to finally reach her fiercely expressive hands. Throughout the endless, highly demanding hours of the royal day, these hands are the ultimate physical instruments of her absolute authority. They are the steady hands that firmly grip the heavy golden scepter of the realm, projecting immovable divine power to the silent, deeply watchful court. They are the precise, highly calculating hands that must repeatedly dip a sharpened goose-feather quill into dark, heavily acidic oak gall ink to draft deeply complicated diplomatic treaties. And, in her absolute darkest, most agonizing hours, they are the very hands that must formally sign the terrifying, irreversible warrants of execution for ambitious, treasonous men who once dared to call themselves her deeply loyal friends. To project the immense wealth and divine favor of her thriving, rapidly expanding empire, her long, remarkably elegant fingers are heavily adorned from the very pale, freezing light of dawn until the deep, comforting shadows of midnight. They are completely encased in massive, highly intricate rings of solid, repeatedly hammered gold, heavily set with cold, dark sapphires, perfectly clear diamonds, and raw, uncut rubies. While these magnificent, glittering jewels dazzle the foreign ambassadors and deeply intimidate her domestic rivals, they act as tiny, profoundly agonizing shackles for the exhausted sovereign. The heavy, unyielding metal bands bite relentlessly into her fragile, aging skin, constantly restricting the natural, healthy flow of her blood and making her delicate joints feel incredibly stiff and profoundly weary as the hours stretch endlessly on. The senior lady in waiting kneels gracefully upon a thick, woven wool rug directly beside the heavily padded velvet chair, gently taking the right hand of the queen into her own softly open palms. The profound physical contrast between the two deeply quiet women is incredibly poignant. The devoted hands of the maid are remarkably soft, deeply warm, and entirely unburdened, while the hands of the queen, though perfectly manicured and heavily perfumed, carry the heavy, undeniable tension of ruling a highly turbulent nation entirely by herself. With breathtakingly slow, deeply deliberate movements, the royal maid begins the intricate process of carefully removing the heavy royal jewellery. She gently grasps the incredibly large, blood-red ruby ring resting heavily upon the index finger, Giving it a remarkably slight, incredibly careful twist, she slowly pulls the cold, heavy metal over the delicate, slightly swollen knuckle. As the thick golden band finally slides completely free from the very tip of the finger, it leaves behind a deep, highly noticeable indentation in the pale, delicate skin. It is a silent, physical memory of the crushing, unrelenting pressure it exerted all day long. The maid gracefully places the heavy royal ring upon a small, velvet-covered silver tray. The heavy metal makes a deeply satisfying, incredibly muffled clink against the soft, crimson fabric. It is a tiny, highly resonant acoustic signal of immense, profound relief echoing softly in the quiet, heavily shadowed chamber. One by one, the heavy, restrictive cages of gold and precious stones are patiently and methodically withdrawn. With every single heavy ring that is gently pulled away, the Queen feels a profound, deeply satisfying lightening of her physical burden. Her stiff, tightly bound fingers, which have been held in a highly rigid, fiercely defensive posture for 16 incredibly long hours, are finally allowed to entirely uncurl and naturally separate in the warm air. Once the royal hands are completely bare, stripped of their terrifying authority and heavy wealth, the young maid steps seamlessly forward once again. She presents a remarkably shallow, beautifully hand-painted porcelain bowl filled entirely with warm, completely clear water that has been lightly infused with sweet, crushed chamomile flowers and fresh rosemary. The senior maid gently submerges the deeply aching, thoroughly exhausted hands of the sovereign into the highly soothing, incredibly fragrant liquid. The immediate rushing wave of heat completely envelops her stiff, weary joints, expertly melting away the deeply rooted, cold, throbbing ache left behind by the heavy jewels. The maid uses her own thumbs to apply a deeply slow, incredibly firm, and highly rhythmic pressure to the sensitive center of the open palms of the Queen. She deliberately massages away the tight, agonizing, cramping pain caused by countless hours of tightly gripping the heavy royal quill. The Queen lets out a profoundly long, perfectly steady, and deeply audible exhale, willingly allowing her long fingers to go entirely limp and weightless in the warm water. She is completely releasing her fierce, desperate, and highly calculated grip on the entire world. She no longer has to precisely control the shifting, dangerous tides of the vast empire, command the heavy wooden fleets, or carefully manage the swirling, treacherous ambitions of the royal court. As the deeply exhausted Queen willingly surrenders her powerful, unyielding grip to the quiet, healing water, I gently invite you to bring a soft, highly focused awareness to your own hands right now. Quietly notice if your own fingers are currently curled tightly inward, unconsciously holding on to a silent, invisible tension carried over from the stressful waking hours. Gently give yourself the complete, absolute permission to let them slowly uncurl. Allow your palms to fall entirely open, resting heavily and completely softly against the warm, comforting fabric of your bed. Let go of whatever heavy burdens you feel. You must tightly control, completely release your desperate grasp on the endless, highly demanding problems of the day, and simply allow your perfectly open, entirely empty hands to gently guide you into a remarkably deep, profoundly peaceful, and entirely unburdened sleep. The quiet, deeply methodical journey of physical release now travels all the way down to the very foundation of the weary sovereign. Throughout the grueling, highly demanding day, the feet of the Queen are forced to endure an unimaginable, deeply hidden agony. To the eager, deeply watchful eyes of the foreign ambassadors and the highly critical royal court, her incredibly energetic movements are a powerful, highly calculated display of immense, unyielding vitality. She must perform incredibly complex, physically demanding dances, stepping and leaping fiercely across the hard stone floors of the Grand Hall for endless hours, deliberately intending to definitively prove that the legendary monarch is completely untouched by the inevitable, creeping frailty of advanced age. She must also stand perfectly still for unimaginably long, highly intricate state ceremonies, bearing the crushing, literal weight of the massive velvet robes and heavy royal jewels, without ever once shifting her weight or showing a single minute sign of physical exhaustion. To complete this terrifying, highly necessary illusion of eternal youth and absolute perfection, her deeply tired feet are tightly bound inside beautifully embroidered, highly restrictive silk slippers that painfully pinch her toes together and offer absolutely no support against the freezing, unforgiving oak floorboards. The youngest lady in waiting kneels gracefully at the very base of the heavily padded velvet chair, keeping her head deeply bowed in an attitude of absolute unspoken reverence. She reaches out with remarkably gentle hands to softly cradle the right foot of the queen. With incredibly slow, deeply deliberate precision, the royal maid carefully unties the tight silken ribbons crossing firmly over the high arch of the foot. The delicate, heavily jewelled slipper is slowly pulled away, gliding remarkably smoothly over the thick, imported silk stockings. The resulting physical relief is wonderfully immediate and profoundly deep. The severely cramped, highly compressed toes, which have been violently forced together inside the narrow, rigid point of the shoe since the very early hours of the freezing morning, are finally allowed to completely expand and gently stretch in the cool night air. The maid gracefully places the beautifully embroidered, profoundly agonizing shoe upon the woven wool rug, where it sits entirely empty, a quietly discarded instrument of political performance. Next, the devoted maid carefully rolls down the thick, tightly woven silk stocking, pulling it gently over the aching heel and sliding it completely off the foot. The sudden, incredibly freeing sensation of the bare skin finally meeting the deeply quiet, pine-scented air of the dim bedchamber sends a sweeping rush of absolute comfort up the entirety of the queen's deeply exhausted leg. A heavy, intricately hammered copper basin is brought quietly forward from the flickering amber shadows, filled entirely with deeply heated water, steeped heavily with crushed peppermint leaves and incredibly soothing natural mineral salts. The maid gently guides the bare, completely exhausted foot of the sovereign directly into the heated liquid. The deep, wonderfully penetrating warmth instantly surrounds the cold, severely throbbing heel and the tightly cramped arch. The queen exhales a remarkably long, entirely unsteady breath, willingly closing her eyes as the profound, deeply medicinal heat expertly draws out the intense, deep-seated pain caused by a lifetime of carrying the heavy, terrifying weight of the entire English realm upon her deeply fragile frame. As the devoted maid gently massages the incredibly sore soles of the queen's feet, patiently working away the deep, heavy knots of accumulated tension with her remarkably soft thumbs, the weary monarch feels entirely beautifully grounded. She is no longer standing fiercely against the shifting, highly dangerous political tides of the treacherous world. She is deeply anchored, entirely safe, and profoundly supported in the quiet dark. I gently invite you to focus your own quiet attention on your deeply tired feet right now. Notice if you are still holding them rigidly, unconsciously preparing to stand up, move forward, or carry a heavy burden. Give yourself the complete, absolute, and unconditional permission to let them entirely go. Allow your heels to sink heavily and deeply into the mattress beneath you. Feel the deep, profoundly comforting warmth of your heavy blankets wrapping softly around your own toes, completely releasing the long, exhausting journey of your own challenging day. Your path is entirely finished for tonight. You have absolutely nowhere else to go, nowhere else you need to be, and absolutely nothing left to do but deeply, profoundly, and beautifully rest in the dark. The deeply restorative cleansing of the queen's deeply exhausted body is finally and completely accomplished. The heavy, profoundly toxic armor of her demanding political day has been entirely washed away, replaced by the remarkably soothing, earthy fragrance of warm herbal balms and sweet almond oil. Now, She must be entirely wrapped in the absolute unconditional comfort of the night. The senior lady in waiting approaches the deeply relaxed sovereign, carrying the final, profoundly significant garment in her open arms. It is the royal night shift, a beautifully simple, incredibly long gown painstakingly woven from the absolute finest, softest imported white linen. This highly intimate piece of clothing stands in breathtaking, profound contrast to the terrifying heavy velvet robes and rigid, aggressively structured bodices she is forced to wear during the waking hours. There are absolutely no unbending strips of heavy whalebone hidden within its seams. There is no heavy, deeply abrasive gold embroidery, no tightly bound silken laces designed to painfully restrict her breathing, and no heavy, jewel-encrusted borders meant to aggressively display the overwhelming wealth of the English Empire. It is simply a pure, completely unburdened cascade of impossibly soft, beautifully warm fabric, completely free from the heavy, suffocating expectations of the royal court. The devoted maids gently lift the magnificent white linen high into the warm, dimly lit air, allowing it to gracefully fall over the Queen's bare shoulders like a highly comforting invisible mist. As the incredibly soft material settles smoothly against her deeply sensitized, beautifully cleansed skin, the physical sensation is one of absolute, pure ecstasy. The fabric glides completely effortlessly over her relaxed collarbone and softly expanding ribcage, flowing naturally all the way down to the polished oak floorboards, without catching on a single restriction. For the very first time in countless deeply agonizing hours, the incredibly weary monarch feels entirely weightless. Her lungs effortlessly draw in a remarkably deep, beautifully, completely unhindered breath, expanding her chest to its absolute fullest, entirely natural capacity. She is entirely wrapped in a profoundly simple, unconditionally forgiving softness, completely returning to the profoundly vulnerable, entirely human state of a tired mortal woman who simply wishes to find a quiet refuge in the dark. The Queen places her lightly oiled, entirely ringless hands upon the softly padded arms of the velvet chair and slowly, deliberately stands up, without the immense, swaying weight of the heavy farthingale dragging her downward. Her deeply tired legs feel surprisingly light and wonderfully unburdened. She takes a remarkably slow, highly mindful step forward. Her bare, cleanly washed feet press softly into the deep, intricately woven wool of the thick Persian rug, feeling the immensely comforting, highly grounded texture completely supporting her shifting weight. She begins her slow, deeply quiet procession across the vast, heavily shadowed bedchamber, walking gracefully toward the magnificent, towering structure of the royal state bed. This deeply carved, incredibly massive oak bed frame is entirely surrounded by heavily draped, wonderfully thick crimson velvet curtains. It is specifically designed to function as a highly secure, entirely impenetrable room within a room, a deeply quiet sanctuary built deliberately to block out the freezing winter drafts and the completely overwhelming, deeply terrifying responsibilities of the massive kingdom. Just moments before, a young maid had carefully passed a long-handled, beautifully polished brass warming pan filled entirely with glowing, sweet-smelling wood coals, closely between the thick, pristine white linen sheets. This deeply caring, highly traditional action has completely banished the cold, damp chill of the massive stone castle, creating a perfectly heated, wonderfully inviting pocket of absolute warmth, patiently waiting in the shadows. As the profoundly exhausted Queen approaches her heavy, deeply inviting bed, ready to completely surrender her fragile body to the soft feather mattresses, I gently invite you to deeply feel the incredibly comforting textures completely surrounding you right now. Notice the absolute, entirely unconditional softness of your own clothing, resting gently against your tired skin. Feel the deeply welcoming, incredibly safe weight of your own blankets warmly covering your deeply relaxed body. Just like the impenetrable heavy velvet curtains tightly surrounding the royal bed, Your own comfortable room is a perfectly safe, profoundly highly guarded sanctuary. The demanding, heavily complicated world outside your door is completely locked away for the night. It cannot reach you here, it cannot ask absolutely anything of you, and you are entirely free to simply sink deeply, heavily, and beautifully into the warm, waiting embrace of the dark. The deeply exhausted sovereign finally reaches the imposing, beautifully carved wooden edge of the towering royal state bed. To carefully access the incredibly elevated, perfectly heated sleeping platform, she must gently place her bare foot upon a small, thickly carpeted wooden step resting quietly upon the polished oak floorboard. This incredibly simple, entirely ungraceful physical movement is the very last effort required of her deeply weary body for the entire night. With a remarkably slow, profoundly heavy sigh, she gently lowers her fragile, entirely unarmored frame onto the pristine white linen sheets. The immediate physical contrast between this deeply yielding surface and the violently unforgiving, rigidly straight wooden throne of the daytime court is absolutely overwhelming. Instead of fiercely demanding that she hold her tired spine in a terrifyingly straight, highly defensive posture to impress the deeply ambitious nobleman, the immense depths of the royal bed actively invite her to completely and utterly collapse. The deeply layered, incredibly thick mattresses, heavily stuffed with the absolute softest, meticulously hand-plucked swan down and rich goose feathers, immediately yield to her completely exhausted weight. The luxurious bedding softly rises up around her narrow shoulders and deeply aching hips, perfectly contouring to the profoundly tired, highly vulnerable shape of the mortal woman hiding seamlessly beneath the heavy weight of the crown. She slowly reclines backward, allowing the incredibly heavy, deeply aching base of her skull to finally sink deeply into the perfectly soft, flawlessly smooth linen pillow. For the very first time since the pale, freezing grey light of the early dawn, her weary neck is entirely relieved of its agonizing, continuous duty. She no longer has to support the massive, suffocating weight of the towering red wig, the heavy golden diadem, or the deeply ingrained, terrifying expectation of eternal, divine vigilance. The senior lady in waiting leans seamlessly over the magnificent edge of the bed, reaching out with deeply devoted, remarkably gentle hands to carefully draw the incredibly heavy, intensely warm layers of woven wool blankets and rich fur coverings upward over the sovereign's entirely relaxed body. The profound, lingering heat deliberately left behind by the polished brass warming pan instantly surrounds her deeply chilled, thoroughly exhausted limbs. It is a highly protective, unconditionally soothing warmth that penetrates straight down to her deeply aching bones, effectively melting away the heavily rooted, lingering cold of the vast stone palace and the entirely terrifying, deeply isolating chill of maintaining absolute power. With the weary queen perfectly settled within the deep, welcoming softness of the feather mattresses, the highly loyal maids begin the profoundly significant, deeply symbolic ritual of completely sealing the royal sanctuary. Moving with breathtakingly slow, completely synchronized grace, they reach for the thick, beautifully embroidered edges of the massive crimson velvet curtains that hang heavily from the towering wooden canopy high above the bed. With a beautifully slow, deeply sweeping motion, they carefully draw the heavy velvet fabric together, sliding the incredibly thick material completely closed along the wooden rails. This deeply quiet, immensely powerful action is the ultimate, final boundary drawn fiercely between the highly vulnerable, entirely mortal woman and the terrifyingly demanding, deeply treacherous world outside. The incredibly thick velvet entirely absorbs the flickering, golden amber light of the burning fireplaces, instantly plunging the enclosed interior of the massive bed into a profoundly deep, incredibly soft and beautifully undisturbed darkness. Inside this tiny, heavily guarded and deeply heated fabric room, there is absolutely no massive royal court, no looming threat of foreign invasion, and no heavy, impossible political decisions left to be made. There is only the deeply comforting, immensely peaceful silence of the highly protected dark. As the deeply exhausted monarch willingly surrenders her heavy consciousness to the absolute safety of the enclosed velvet sanctuary, I gently invite you to draw your own invisible, deeply comforting curtains closely around you. Consciously pull the soft, highly protective boundaries of your own quiet room tightly shut against the heavy, demanding anxieties of the waking world. Allow the deeply supportive, incredibly soft mattress beneath you to completely absorb the heavy, lingering physical tension of your own long day. Feel the profound, entirely unconditional warmth of your heavy blankets wrapping completely around your tired shoulders, keeping you profoundly safe, beautifully secure, and deeply protected from the cold, heavy demands of tomorrow. There is absolutely nothing left to solve tonight, no distant personal battles left to fight, and absolutely nowhere else you ever need to be. You are completely enveloped in a beautiful, incredibly heavy darkness, profoundly ready to drift entirely away into a deeply healing, unbroken, and thoroughly peaceful sleep. The physical world of the royal court has completely vanished behind the heavy crimson velvet curtains. Inside the enclosed sanctuary of the state bed, the Queen is surrounded by a profound, impenetrable darkness. It is not a frightening or deeply isolating dark, but rather a remarkably heavy, unconditionally comforting blanket of shadow that asks absolutely nothing of her deeply exhausted eyes. Without the harsh, flickering amber light of the candles, or the calculating, endless stares of the ambitious nobleman, her mind is finally granted the absolute permission to entirely unbind. The fiercely intelligent, highly strategic thoughts that have relentlessly occupied her waking hours, the complex diplomatic treaties, the massive military strategies, and the deeply hidden personal anxieties, begin to slowly fragment and gently dissolve into the warm, incredibly still air. She no longer has to actively think, carefully plan, or fiercely defend her beloved kingdom. She only has to deeply and beautifully exist within the quiet, perfectly heated space of her own steady breathing. Beyond the thick, beautifully embroidered boundaries of the velvet curtains, the sprawling, ancient stone bedchamber is slowly preparing for its own deep, undisturbed slumber. The devoted ladies in waiting have quietly retreated to the outermost shadows of the vast room, their soft, incredibly gentle footsteps completely muffled by the heavily layered, intricately woven wool rugs. The only remaining sound in the deeply hushed environment is the slow, incredibly peaceful dying of the massive fireplaces. The roaring, highly energetic winter flames that had fiercely battled the deep castle chill throughout the long evening have gracefully collapsed into a deeply glowing, remarkably quiet bed of intensely hot wood coals. The heavy oak logs occasionally emit a remarkably soft, profoundly muffled crackle, a deeply rhythmic, entirely organic sound that beautifully underscores the absolute silence of the room. The incredibly warm, deeply comforting scent of the roasting wood softly permeates the thick velvet hangings, mixing seamlessly with the lingering, healing fragrance of the dried lavender and sweet almond oil, creating a deeply hypnotic, profoundly soothing atmosphere that heavily encourages the weary mind to completely let go. Far beyond the heavily fortified, immensely thick stone walls of the palace, the freezing winter wind blows relentlessly across the dark, completely frozen landscape. It occasionally brushes against the thick, leaded glass of the high bedchamber windows with a faint, deeply distant whisper, but rather than causing any distress or waking anxiety, this incredibly muffled, highly remote sound only serves to deeply amplify the profound, undeniable sense of absolute safety and complete physical isolation hidden within the royal bed. The furious, fiercely demanding world outside is entirely powerless against the deeply layered, incredibly warm, and profoundly guarded sanctuary of the sleeping sovereign. The deeply exhausted queen listens quietly to the very faint, completely harmless sigh of the winter wind feeling the intense, entirely unconditional warmth of her heavy fur blankets closely holding her tired body. Her breathing gradually slows into a remarkably deep, beautifully hypnotic, and entirely steady rhythm. Each incredibly long, profoundly slow inhale draws in the deeply comforting, immensely peaceful quiet of the room, and each incredibly heavy, completely unrestricted exhale pushes the very last, lingering traces of her political exhaustion far away into the deep shadows. As the heavy, completely peaceful rhythm of the breathing sovereign becomes the only true focal point in the quiet dark, I gently invite you to completely synchronize your own breathing with this profoundly relaxing, deeply steady cycle. Allow every single inhale to become noticeably longer, deeply smoother, and entirely unhurried. Feel your completely relaxed chest gently rise without any forced effort whatsoever. As you slowly release the quiet air, willfully allow your heavily exhausted body to sink just a fraction of an inch deeper into the perfectly soft, incredibly welcoming mattress entirely supporting you. Completely release any remaining, highly stubborn thoughts about the heavy demands of yesterday or the deeply unknown challenges of tomorrow. You are entirely enveloped in exactly the same profound, incredibly heavy, and beautifully secure darkness that completely protects the sleeping monarch. Let the immensely comforting, entirely silent weight of the night press softly against your deeply relaxed shoulders, gently guiding your completely quiet mind downward into a remarkably deep, beautifully uninterrupted, and profoundly restorative sleep. Safe within the heavy, completely impenetrable boundaries of the crimson velvet curtains, the Queen does not drift into an empty void, but rather settles deeply into the profound, quiet reality of her heavily fortified world. Though she is entirely removed from the terrifying political gaze of the daytime court, she is acutely aware of the vast, highly structured machinery of the Tudor palace continuing its silent, endless vigil all around her. Just beyond the massive, intricately carved oak doors of her private bedchamber stands the highly dedicated night watch of the yeomen of the guard. In the freezing, deeply shadowed stone corridors of Whitehall Palace, these fiercely loyal men stand completely motionless in their heavy wool tunics. They grip their long steel-bladed halberds with calloused hands, serving as a highly literal, deeply physical wall of absolute devotion between the fragile, sleeping sovereign and any lingering threats from the treacherous, wildly unpredictable world outside. Knowing that these trusted men are silently holding the line allows the exhausted monarch to finally relinquish her own fierce, deeply ingrained need for constant vigilance. As her deeply tired mind slowly lets go of the heavy, imposing architecture of the palace, it naturally reaches outward to the ancient, highly rhythmic sound endlessly echoing against the massive stone foundations of the building. It is the deep, powerfully rushing current of the River Thames. The Thames is the vast, dark and endlessly moving artery of the massive English realm, and its continuous presence is deeply woven into the very fabric of her long, highly turbulent historical life. In the terrifying, profoundly uncertain years of her deeply troubled youth, this very same river carried her upon its dark, freezing waters directly toward the terrifying Traitors' Gate at the Tower of London, a journey filled entirely with the suffocating, highly realistic fear of imminent execution. But tonight that dark, terrifying history is safely buried entirely in the past. Tonight the great river carries only the highly peaceful, immensely prosperous merchant ships of a thriving, incredibly stable kingdom safely at rest under her unyielding protection. The heavy, beautifully muffled sound of the tidal water gently washing against the freezing stone walls of the palace creates a deeply steady, highly hypnotic acoustic anchor in the dark. It is a profoundly ancient, completely natural rhythm that existed long before the heavy Tudor crowns were ever forged and will continue to deeply resonate long after the massive palace eventually crumbles to dust. The Queen listens quietly to the incredibly slow, beautifully relentless push and pull of the deep water. The heavy, dark tide sweeps slowly inward from the distant sea, completely filling the deep riverbed, and then gracefully, seamlessly releases, pulling the freezing water back out into the vast, unknown ocean. It is the deep, entirely natural breathing of the English earth itself. As the sleeping monarch aligns her own deeply exhausted, entirely fragile human breathing with the profound ancient rhythm of the sweeping river tide, I gently invite you to do the exact same in the quiet safety of your own room. Listen closely to the slow, completely steady rhythm of your own breath entering and leaving your profoundly relaxed body. Imagine it as that exact same heavy, sweeping river tide. With every single incredibly long, beautifully deep inhale, you draw in absolute, completely unshakable peace and physical healing. And with every single remarkably slow, totally unforced exhale, you allow the deep, dark water to gently carry away any lingering, stubborn anxieties from your heavily taxed mind. The demanding, profoundly complicated history of your own day is entirely finished, completely washed away by the tide, leaving you profoundly safe, deeply anchored, and beautifully ready for a flawless, deeply restorative sleep. The heavy crimson velvet curtains are completely drawn, successfully sealing the sovereign inside a perfectly heated, absolutely quiet sanctuary. Yet, while her deeply exhausted physical body has finally surrendered to the yielding softness of the feather mattresses, the fiercely intelligent, highly guarded mind of the monarch requires a much deeper, vastly more profound unbinding. For many long decades, her ultimate survival has depended entirely upon a terrifying, hyper-vigilant instinct, an incredibly sharp mental armor forged in the absolute darkest, coldest chapter of her turbulent youth. Lying perfectly still in the warm, pine-scented darkness, the faint, profoundly distant rhythm of the river tide, gently washing against the palace walls, occasionally brings forth a chilling, deeply buried memory. It is the inescapable heavy silence of the bell tower. In the freezing, deeply terrifying spring of 1554, she was not the untouchable, divinely ordained Queen of England. She was merely Princess Elizabeth, a terrified, deeply isolated prisoner of her own reigning half-sister, locked securely within the massive, unforgiving stone walls of the Tower of London. Every single morning in that damp, deeply suffocating cell began with the heavy, agonizing dread that she would suddenly hear the sharp, metallic scrape of the executioner's axe being slowly sharpened in the cobblestone courtyard below. The absolute suffocating terror of imminent, violent death forced her to build an impenetrable, highly complex fortress within her own mind. It ruthlessly taught her to completely hide her true emotions, to constantly analyze every single whispered word of her captors, and to never entirely lower her defensive guard. That profound, agonizing historical trauma created the legendary unyielding monarch the entire world intensely fears today. Her brilliant mind was permanently conditioned to treat every single shadow as a deeply hidden assassin, and every quiet moment as a brief, terrifying prelude to total destruction. But here, wrapped tightly in the profound safety of the velvet enclosure, the aging queen deliberately chooses to confront that deeply buried, intensely frightened girl. She knows that, to truly find the elusive mercy of sleep, she must consciously tell her deeply traumatized subconscious that the desperate war for basic survival has already been won. With a remarkably slow, deeply steady exhale that slightly shifts the heavy fur blankets resting upon her chest, she quietly confirms to the trembling ghosts of her past that the terrifying ordeal is definitively, entirely over. The heavy, iron-studded oak doors of the palace are no longer locked heavily from the outside to keep her desperately imprisoned. They are heavily bolted from the inside, guarded intensely by fiercely loyal armies, specifically designed to keep her completely unconditionally safe. She willfully allows the intensely cold, damp memory of the prison stones to be entirely absorbed and gently melted away by the profound, heavy warmth pressing softly against her skin. The desperately forged survival instinct, which fiercely demands that she sleep with one eye constantly open to watch the shadows, is finally given the absolute, unconditional permission to completely stand down. The heavy crown has been firmly secured, the bloody executioner's block has been entirely avoided, and she has magnificently, undeniably survived. As the deeply resting queen profoundly releases the terrifying iron grip of her own historical trauma into the quiet shadows, I gently invite you to search the quiet, unseen corners of your own mind. Notice quietly if you are unconsciously holding on to a heavy, outdated survival instinct of your own, a lingering, deeply hidden anxiety from a past struggle that simply no longer serves your present reality. You have successfully navigated those difficult, heavily demanding chapters of your own life. The deeply terrifying storms of your past are entirely finished. Gently give your own tired mind the absolute, completely unconditional permission to recognize its current, profound safety. Allow the deep, incredible warmth of your own bed to completely melt away those old, heavy defensive walls. You do not have to fight those past battles tonight. You are incredibly safe, profoundly protected, and entirely free to simply sink downward into a remarkably deep, beautifully peaceful, and completely unbroken sleep. Having successfully banished the freezing, deeply terrifying ghosts of the bell tower, the profoundly weary mind of the sovereign slowly drifts away from the bitter instinct of survival, travelling backward toward a much warmer, entirely heartbreaking memory. Beneath the heavy, incredibly thick layers of goose feathers and woven wool, the deeply sensitive heart of the monarch quietly beats against a deeply buried, profoundly tender wound. In the absolute, perfectly undisturbed silence of the state bed, the faint, lingering scent of the sweet rosewater gently drying upon her skin unexpectedly conjures the magnificent, wildly intoxicating summer of 1575. The dark, heavily draped walls of the Whitehall bedchamber seamlessly fade away, softly replaced by the wildly vibrant, deeply fragrant gardens of Kenilworth Castle. It was there, amidst the staggering, unprecedented extravagance of deeply illuminated lakes and completely breathtaking firework displays, that Robert Dudley, the incredibly handsome Earl of Leicester and the absolutely undisputed, profoundly undeniable love of her entire life, made his absolute final, deeply desperate plea for her hand in marriage. For a few fleeting, intensely beautiful days under the warm July sun, she had allowed herself to deeply indulge in the profound, intoxicating illusion that she might actually be permitted to step down from the terrifyingly isolated, impossibly high pedestal of the Tudor throne. She desperately wanted to be just a woman, entirely free to simply love the man who had unconditionally stood fiercely by her side since the deeply terrifying shadows of their youth. But the incredibly heavy, violently demanding Crown of England is a profoundly jealous, entirely unforgiving master. Her fiercely logical, heavily burdened mind completely understood the absolute, undeniable truth. To willingly marry an English subject would instantly spark a devastating, incredibly bloody civil war among the deeply ambitious, heavily armed nobility. To purposefully marry a powerful foreign prince would permanently surrender the absolute sovereignty of her beloved island to an unknown, fiercely calculating empire. To completely save her incredibly fragile nation, she had to purposefully, consciously, and completely shatter her own deeply passionate heart. She definitively chose to marry her incredibly demanding kingdom, forever condemning herself to the immense, profoundly echoing loneliness of the massive royal bed. Tonight, safely hidden away within the intensely private, perfectly black enclosure of the velvet curtains, the incredibly powerful monarch entirely drops the fierce, brilliantly constructed facade of the untouchable Virgin Queen. She willingly allows herself to deeply and truly feel the immense, profoundly agonizing weight of that monumental personal sacrifice. She does not attempt to aggressively push the deeply beautiful, terribly painful ghost of Robert Dudley away. Instead, she gently welcomes the profoundly sweet memory of his incredibly warm, completely devoted smile, quietly acknowledging the immense, deeply hidden toll of a life lived entirely for the absolute benefit of others. With a remarkably long, profoundly deep, and incredibly fragile sigh, she actively breathes out the heavy, lingering sorrow of all the deeply beautiful things she was forced to completely deny herself. She actively forgives herself for the deeply ruthless, heavily agonizing choices she was required to make. The immense, sprawling kingdom is completely safe, highly prosperous, and fiercely independent directly because of her deeply painful sacrifice. Having fully paid that unimaginable, fiercely demanding price, her duty is completely fulfilled, and she is finally entirely free to rest. As the deeply resting sovereign gracefully releases the incredibly heavy, profoundly aching burden of her own intensely personal sacrifices into the quiet night, I gently invite you to softly turn your own attention inward. Notice quietly if you are carrying the heavy, unspoken emotional weight of placing the endless, highly demanding needs of absolutely everyone else firmly before your own. You may have made deeply difficult, completely unrecognized choices to protect, carefully provide for, or deeply support the people in your own demanding world. Tonight, in the profound, unconditionally safe darkness of your own quiet room, you are entirely allowed to gently lay that heavy, exhausting responsibility down. You do not have to be fiercely strong for absolutely anyone right now. Allow the deeply welcoming, incredibly soft mattress beneath you to warmly embrace you, providing the profound, completely unconditional comfort and deeply soothing support that you endlessly give to the challenging world. Breathe in the absolute peace of this highly protected moment and beautifully allow yourself to slowly, gently drift away into a remarkably deep, completely unburdened, and entirely restorative sleep. As the agonizing ghosts of lost love gently fade into the heavy velvet shadows, the resting mind of the sovereign confronts one final, monumental echo of her long reign. The quiet darkness of the state bed is briefly interrupted by the intensely burning memory of the summer of 1588. It was the absolute terrifying pinnacle of her life, the horrifying moment the massive, seemingly invincible Spanish armada sailed determinedly toward the vulnerable English Channel. Standing bravely before her deeply frightened troops at Tilbury, she miraculously summoned the ultimate strength of a true warrior, fiercely declaring she possessed the mighty heart of a king. That towering display of absolute courage saved her beloved island from total, bloody annihilation. Yet, carrying the crushing psychological weight of that roaring lion every single day is a profoundly exhausting burden for a deeply mortal woman. To constantly project absolute, unwavering fearlessness required an unimaginable daily expenditure of pure emotional energy. But tonight, perfectly enveloped in the intensely heated, completely secure cocoon of the massive royal bed, the deafening roar of those ancient cannons is definitively silenced. The formidable enemy galleons rest peacefully at the very bottom of the dark ocean, and the shores of her kingdom remain entirely safe. She does not need to be a legendary, lion-hearted warrior in the quiet dark. She willfully unbinds the heavy psychological armor of absolute leadership, allowing her deeply tired muscles to melt completely into the impossibly soft goose feathers. As the sleeping sovereign gracefully surrenders her deeply ingrained need to be fiercely strong, I gently invite you to completely release your own heavy armor. You do not have to be the brave, unyielding leader for anyone tonight. Completely let go of the exhausting heavy pressure to remain perfectly resilient in the face of your daily challenges. Allow the incredibly soft, unconditionally supportive mattress to hold you securely, guiding your quiet mind downward into a remarkably peaceful, entirely unguarded, and deeply restorative sleep. The heavy, highly protective shadows of the velvet canopy finally reach the deepest, most fiercely guarded chamber of the sovereign's deeply exhausted heart. Beneath the brilliant towering triumphs and the incredibly agonizing sacrifices lies a profoundly silent, profoundly ancient wound. It is the inescapable, deeply tragic ghost of her deeply misunderstood mother, Anne Boleyn. For her entire historical life, bearing the highly controversial blood of the spectacularly disgraced queen was a terrifying political liability, a deeply hidden source of immense, profoundly unspoken sorrow. She was the terrified motherless daughter, violently stripped of her rightful legitimacy by the terrifying decree of her own father, left to fiercely navigate a deeply treacherous world entirely alone. To survive the brutal, heavily demanding royal court, she was forced to completely lock away any visible grief for the incredibly beautiful, fiercely intelligent woman who tragically perished upon the brutal wooden scaffold. But tonight, in the absolute, unconditional safety of the profoundly quiet dark, the aging monarch definitively releases that heavy, agonizing burden of deeply inherited trauma. She no longer hides from the tragic shadow of her bloodline. Instead, she gently embraces the profound, beautiful realization that the exact same brilliant, completely unyielding spirit that once condemned her mother is the very force that miraculously allowed her to magnificently conquer the world. She has entirely justified her mother's agonizing fall by becoming the absolute greatest monarch her massive kingdom has ever known. With a remarkably long, beautifully unhindered sigh, the very last heavy emotional chain tying her to the waking world is gracefully severed. The Queen finds absolute, completely unconditional peace with her own history, as her heavily resting body sinks entirely into the impossibly soft feather mattresses. I gently invite you to softly release any heavy, lingering regrets from your own deeply complicated past. You absolutely do not have to carry the heavy, exhausting burdens of yesterday into the quiet sanctuary of tonight. Completely forgive your own mistakes. Gently accept the challenging journey that safely brought you here, and allow the incredibly soft, deeply welcoming darkness to guide you completely downward into a wonderfully deep, beautifully unbroken, and entirely restorative sleep. With every single agonizing knot of her deeply complicated past completely untangled, the fiercely brilliant mind of the sovereign finally ceases its relentless labor. The heavy, profoundly detailed memories of towering castles and deeply tragic losses gracefully evaporate into the warm, incredibly still air. She is entirely emptied of her demanding royal identity. In this profoundly quiet, absolutely sacred space beneath the heavy velvet canopy, she is no longer the legendary Queen of England. She is simply a completely weightless, deeply tired soul, willingly surrendering to the immense, unconditionally comforting void of the night. The incredibly heavy, perfectly heated darkness surrounding her deeply relaxed body slowly transforms into a vast, wonderfully calm ocean of pure, undisturbed shadow. There are absolutely no turbulent waves of anxiety here, no highly demanding currents of political duty, and no sharp reefs of hidden danger. There is only the profoundly gentle, incredibly slow rise and fall of the dark water, moving perfectly in sync with the deeply rhythmic, remarkably steady breathing of her completely resting body. As she floats effortlessly upon this magnificent, highly protective ocean of sleep, the very last fragments of her conscious thought dissolve entirely. The heavy, exhausting pull of gravity is completely forgotten, replaced by a beautiful sensation of absolute, unburdened freedom. As the deeply sleeping monarch drifts peacefully further out into the endless, deeply healing waters of the night, I gently invite you to willingly wade into that exact same, profoundly comforting ocean. Completely release your desperate grip on the highly structured, heavily demanding shores of the waking world. You absolutely do not need to remember your heavy responsibilities or your complex history tonight. Willingly allow the incredibly soft, deeply gentle currents of the dark to completely support your tired weight. Breathe in the vast, perfectly silent peace of this beautiful void, and let the wonderfully soothing water gently carry you downward into a remarkably deep, completely dreamless, and entirely perfect slumber. As the completely weightless soul of the sleeping monarch floats ever deeper into the vast, beautifully undisturbed ocean of the night, the fiercely demanding construct of time itself begins to completely dissolve. Throughout the endlessly long waking day, the highly structured royal schedule was brutally dictated by the heavy, incredibly loud striking of the massive brass clocks. Every single passing hour violently demanded her absolute unbroken attention. But here, perfectly sealed within the heavy, deeply comforting crimson velvet curtains, that relentless, terrifying march of time is definitively halted. The deeply quiet, remarkably slow rhythm of her profoundly relaxed breathing becomes the only true measure of existence left in the warm dark. The immense machinery of the entire English realm has entirely ceased its noisy labour to unconditionally honour this perfectly protected silence. The towering, incredibly thick stone walls of the ancient palace stand completely motionless, acting as a highly impenetrable physical barrier against the fiercely unpredictable rush of tomorrow. Inside this beautifully heated sanctuary there is absolutely no morning rapidly approaching, and no heavy past left to deeply regret. There is only the absolute, infinitely expansive present moment of pure, entirely uninterrupted rest. As the heavily sleeping queen rests beautifully within this perfectly suspended, entirely timeless void, I gently invite you to completely surrender your own heavy awareness of the passing hours. Willingly let go of the highly anxious need to carefully count the limited time you have left before dawn. The beautifully heavy, profoundly comforting darkness completely surrounding you is absolutely endless and entirely unhurried. You are safely anchored in a deeply peaceful, perfectly still pocket of eternity. Breathe in the profoundly timeless quiet, and allow yourself to gently drift completely away into a remarkably deep, beautifully undisturbed, and profoundly restorative slumber. The sleeping sovereign has finally reached the absolute deepest, most profoundly restorative realm of the night. Within the heavily guarded, perfectly heated sanctuary of the royal bed, all fleeting images and fragmented dreams have entirely ceased to exist. She is completely enveloped in a beautifully pure, absolutely flawless void of velvet darkness. In this magnificent, completely untroubled state, the heavy physical toll of her deeply demanding reign is quietly and methodically repaired. Her breathing is now incredibly shallow, perfectly even, and so profoundly quiet that it seems to blend seamlessly with the ancient, heavy silence of the massive stone castle itself. Her deeply exhausted body, entirely supported by the impossibly soft feather mattresses, feels wonderfully heavy, as if she has been completely woven into the very fabric of the incredibly comforting bed. The highly resilient, brilliantly sharp mind that safely guides an entire sprawling empire is completely at rest, requiring absolutely nothing, anticipating absolutely nothing, and defending against absolutely nothing. She is entirely safe, beautifully still, and profoundly at peace. As the heavily resting monarch sinks into this ultimate, completely dreamless void, I gently invite you to willingly follow her into the absolute depths of the night. Willingly allow the heavy, intensely comforting darkness to completely fill your quiet mind, gently washing away any tiny, lingering fragments of thought. Feel the immense, beautifully relaxing weight of your own body pressing deeply into the incredibly soft mattress. There is absolutely nothing left to hold on to, and nothing left to do. Simply breathe in the profound, healing silence, and willingly allow yourself to gently fall completely away into a wonderfully deep, entirely undisturbed, and beautifully perfect rest. The immense, heavily fortified stone castle stands as a perfectly silent, profoundly steadfast guardian in the deep winter night. Inside the entirely shadowed, heavily draped royal bedchamber, the glowing wood coals in the massive stone fireplace have finally faded into remarkably soft, completely cooling ash. The demanding world outside is entirely still, respectfully granting the sleeping sovereign her absolute, completely unbroken peace. The deeply steady, beautifully quiet rhythm of her profoundly relaxed breathing is the very last, incredibly subtle movement in the deeply dark room. She is completely safe, profoundly anchored, and beautifully surrendered to the deeply healing embrace of the night. The thick, incredibly heavy crimson velvet curtains remain tightly closed, permanently separating the exhausting, highly relentless demands of the waking world from the absolute sanctity of this profound slumber. The massive, deeply complex kingdom rests beautifully and securely under the protective, quiet shadow of the throne, requiring absolutely nothing more from the deeply resting monarch tonight. The story of the long day has definitively ended, and the incredibly peaceful silence has utterly triumphed. As the absolute perfectly quiet darkness completely envelops the sleeping sovereign, it also softly, entirely enfolds you. Every single heavily exhausted muscle in your perfectly resting body is completely relaxed, entirely supported by the incredible, unconditional softness beneath you. Your deeply quiet mind is beautifully empty, completely free from the heavy, lingering weight of the day. The profoundly long journey is entirely finished. The highly demanding world is safely, completely locked away. Simply allow the profound, beautifully absolute silence to gently carry you downward into the deepest, most profoundly restorative, and entirely perfect sleep. Good night.